In this episode of the King's Hall podcast, we want to ask and answer three important questions. Why aren't we signing or supporting the Antioch Declaration? What is the vision for Christian nationalism we're promoting? And finally, what are we hoping will come from this episode? We'll delve into those questions in just a moment, but first, this is after all the King's Hall, we'll begin with a story. In 1925, William F. Buckley Jr. was born in New York to a millionaire Texas oil baron. He would receive the most lavish of upbringings thanks to his father's massive wealth, as the family occupied multiple residences in England, France, and Connecticut. He received his early education from private tutors and an English all-boys school, then later a prep school in New York. After a year of studies at the University of Mexico, Buckley would serve 3 years in the U.S. Army during World War II as a second lieutenant. After the war, Buckley enrolled at Yale, where he was a member of the secretive and all-powerful Skull and Bones Society, an odd group shrouded in dark mystery and cultic ritual. Founded in 1832, the secret society is also known as Order 322 and the Brotherhood of Death. Stories about the society abound, from rumors that they met in a tomb near campus to initiation rites that induced loud wailing and the drinking of blood from a skull, and even a fixation with the occult. As for the meaning of 322, it is said to be the date of Demosthenes' death, 322 BC, a man known for his brilliant intellect and political savvy. The society also worships Eulogia, the goddess of eloquence. Its members, known as Bonesmen, have been connected to various conspiracy theories, largely because they have always formed an interconnected network of America's most powerful elites. Bonesmen alumni include men like Buckley, George H.W. Bush, John Kerry, and many others who have occupied roles in the State Department, White House, Judiciary, and CIA. In 1951, Buckley signed on at the Central Intelligence Agency and worked in Mexico. While at the CIA, he published God and Man at Yale, and later The Road to Yenin, which told of a communist conspiracy to obtain world domination. In 1954, Buckley wrote another book, this time defending Joseph McCarthy and his purge of communists. Then, a pivotal moment that would shape the landscape of conservative politics for decades. In 1955, Buckley founded National Review, a right-wing journal with tremendous influence on the elite ruling class. Because of his work at National Review, Buckley would become a conservative icon. Later, in 1962, Buckley's column On the Right would appear in more than 200 newspapers nationwide. He would also serve as host of the PBS television show Firing Line in the late 1960s. He supported Barry Goldwater and later launched Ronald Reagan into the political stratosphere. Buckley met Reagan before he had entered politics and helped jumpstart his political career, first as governor of California, then for the presidency. Buckley's career was not without controversy, as he weaved together powerful relationships between an elite class of politicians, statesmen, and the intelligence community. For example, on September 18, 1976, a Chilean foreign ambassador was killed in a car bomb. Several of George H.W. Bush's agents were connected to the assassination, and so as director of the CIA, Bush quickly sought to cover up the incident by spreading disinformation. Buckley also took part in the disinformation campaign. In fact, he ran disinformation campaigns for Chilean factions as early as October 1974, according to investigative journalist Donald Freed. He also discovered that Buckley's brother, James, had met with the assassin, Michael Townley, a week before the assassination. Townley later confessed to the killing. Buckley also played a somewhat controversial role as editor-in-chief at National Review because of the way he used his position to gatekeep the right, which led to his extremely public fallout with several of his longtime friends and writers. One of those men was Joe Sobran, who wrote for National Review for years, but came into Buckley's bad graces because of his stance on Israel. Critical of U.S. foreign policy in relation to Israel, Sobran was a decorated journalist, devout Roman Catholic, commentator on CBS Radio, and regular columnist for the Los Angeles Times and Chronicles magazine. He was also a media fellow at the Mises Institute. In 1993, Buckley took Sobran to lunch and told him to stop criticizing Israel's domestic and foreign policies because Buckley said, quote, "We need these people," end quote, referring to the Jews. Sobran refused to budge on the issue, resulting in his abrupt and unceremonious firing. Buckley reportedly returned to his office after their lunch and sent his old friend a fax informing him of his termination. What brought about Buckley's ultimatum was that Sobran had written a column in which he said Buckley was, quote, "jumpy about the Jews." He hadn't just touched the third rail of Jewish influence in America, Sobran had grabbed it with both hands. It would spell the end of his time at National Review. Of the incident, Sobran later said, quote, "Since then, it has become a neoconservative legend that I was fired for antisemitism. But the truth is that it was far more personal than that. Bill knew me too well to make such a charge. I was fired for making him look bad. He considered making others look bad his prerogative," end quote. Once loyal friends and fellow Catholics, Buckley would indeed publicly smear Sobran and Pat Buchanan, also a writer for National Review, as anti-Semites. It wasn't a new initiative for Buckley. After starting the magazine, he took it upon himself to ensure that anyone critical of the Jews or a Jewish state would not be welcome in the conservative ranks. It became part of his key mission to root out those who'd taken the wrong side on Israel. In the end, he would politically and economically destroy anyone who opposed pro-Israel foreign policy, including old friends. Although conservative, Buckley was also squarely within the 1950s liberal consensus, or what has been lately called the post-war consensus. Even as communism, with its death toll in the hundreds of millions, stood threateningly off to the left, Buckley's conservatives also began to fear the reemergence of a right-wing threat in the form of fascism, with its attendant companions, religion and nationalism. Buckley's anti-communistic bent was a major feature of the direction in which he ultimately took the conservative movement as a whole. And in this, he would play a leading role in reducing the right to a monolith based not in true conservatism, but in the left liberal consensus. As long as someone was an avowed anti-communist, or more particularly, an anti-Stalinist or anti-Sovietist, Buckley was generally willing to welcome them into the conservative ranks. From the 1930s to the 1950s, the conservative movement was dominated by the old right, with its emphasis on opposition to the New Deal policies of FDR, the Federal Reserve, and globalist intervention on the foreign policy front. But then, in the 1960s with National Review, Buckley started purging right-wing ranks of what he considered radicals, which largely meant the old right. Buckley would in turn welcome Trotskyites, New Deal Social Democrats, Truman Humphrey liberals, and others from the quota-loving, advanced victimological left. And this group would become what we now call the neoconservatives. As Murray Rothbard pointed out, Buckley has effectively purged the conservative movement of the real right and allowed it to be taken over by enemies. Why did Buckley, the self-appointed pope of conservatism, do it? After helping Reagan get elected in the 1980s, Buckley was ready to take his movement to the real places of power in America. To do this, he judged that conservatives had to rebrand themselves in a way that gained them respectability with liberal centrist elites. He was constantly concerned, for example, about what the editorial board at the New York Times thought of him. As Paul Gottfried wrote, quote, "Like many other American journalists in the second half of the last century, Buckley moved periodically to the left to remain relevant. He also moved in that direction during the second half of his life because of his extensive involvement in New York social life," end quote. Gottfried concluded with an anecdote from his interactions late in Buckley's life. He wrote, quote, "As a final memory, I recall my correspondence with Buckley in the late 1990s, when he asserted that he had never changed his political or moral principles. I only wish that were true," end quote. Buckley's strategic maneuvering was controlled, effectively, by the gaze of those to his left. Rothbard explains, quote, "Buckley was almost ready to take power in America, but not quite, because first, all of the various heretics of the right, some left over from the original right, all the groups that were in any way radical or could deprive the new conservative movement of its much-desired respectability in the eyes of the liberal and centrist elite, all these had to be jettisoned," end quote. The purge included most especially men like Joe Sobran and Pat Buchanan and the John Birch Society, all of whom represented that old right. The Birchers were out not because they were anti-Semitic, as Buckley claimed, but because they opposed U.S. intervention in the Vietnam War and the global proxy wars in general. But it's also important to understand how these opponents of Buckley were attacked and where. Buckley would dig deep into the left's playbook for his official excommunications. Again, Rothbard writes, quote, "They would trot out the old psychobabble as well as the old smears of bigotry, anti-Semitism, the specter of Franco, and all the rest," end quote. Most especially, they would accuse Buchanan of being psychologically unstable, full of negative emotions, including anger and resentment. Buckley and the neocons managed to establish the notion that anyone to the right of them was, by definition, the representative of forces of darkness, of chaos, old night, racism, and anti-Semitism. The basic method, Rothbard went on, was to divert attention from the content of the radical right message and direct attention instead to a personal smear of groups on the right, end quote. Radicals on the right, Buckley and others would claim, suffered from what they called, quote, politics of resentment, end quote. It's worth pointing out that the same strategy is in play today. Instead of engaging the arguments of the so-called radical right, liberal gatekeeping conservatives will charge that their opponents are seething with hatred or crackling with envy. Buckley chose the media as his battleground for the purge of radicals on the right. But why? Clearly, Rothbard said, because the media, especially the respectable and influential media, begin and continue with a strong left liberal bias, end quote. Virtually every conservative in the mainstream media is what Rothbard called an establishment liberal conservative. The motivation Rothbard returns to time and again for Buckley is respectability, and through it, access to mainstream platforms and power. Of Buckley's role in policing and purging the right, John Miller wrote in National Review, quote, "In his pivotal role as doyen of the American right, Buckley ensured that anti-Semites had no place in the pages of conservatism's flagship publication, National Review. But as the Cold War came to an end, right-wing anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism reappeared. As the writings and statements of men like Pat Buchanan and Joe Sobran became even more hostile to Jews in Israel, Buckley again stepped into the breach. In a special issue of the magazine, and then in a fuller and annotated book, Buckley set out in search of anti-Semitism. Though he said it pained him to accuse his longtime friends and allies, Buckley ultimately concluded that men like Sobran could not be defended from the charge of anti-Semitism that ought to have no place on the right, end quote. Miller is right to point out that Buckley had been involved with purges from the beginning, but it was not primarily because of anti-Semitism in the early days. Mainly, it was because these voices, many of them Jewish, were against U.S. military intervention on a global scale. Buckley's purge of anti-Semites would take full force in the late 1980s and 90s. In the early 1990s, just as Pat Buchanan announced his presidential run, a special issue of National Review hit newsstands. Its focus was on anti-Semitism. Buckley's keynote article set the tone. It was titled, "In Search of Anti-Semitism." In the essay, which later became a book by the same title, Buckley charged Pat Buchanan, Joe Sobran, and Gore Vidal with anti-Semitism because of their views on Israeli foreign policy and their contention that American Jews had divided national loyalties. It was quite obviously a well-timed political hit job. With the old right ascendant in the person of Buchanan, it was an opportunity for Buckley to parade out his old bag of tricks and smears. Again, Rothbard writes, quote, "It was time to trot out the old master, the prince of excommunication, the self-appointed pope of the conservative movement, William F. Buckley Jr. It was time for Bill Buckley's papal bull," end quote. The problem for Buckley was that he wasn't up to his old form. Again, Rothbard describes the essay In Search of Anti-Semitism in this way, quote, "The first thing to say about Buckley's essay is that it is virtually unreadable. Gone, all gone is the wit and the sparkle. Buckley's tendency to the rococo, an elaborately ornamental style, has elongated beyond measure. His prose is serpentine, involuted, and convoluted, twisted and qualified until virtually all sense is lost. Reading the whole thing through is doing penance for one's sins, and one can accomplish the task only if possessed by a stern sense of duty, as one grits one's teeth and plows through a pile of turgid and pointless student term papers, which indeed Buckley's essay matches in content, in learning, and in style." End quote. Buckley may have lost his touch in later years, but in his prime, he was a master wordsmith with an extensive vocabulary and sharp wit. He was also often quite clever and subtle in how he accused Sobran and Buchanan of antisemitism. He often left himself a path of escape should pushback to his claims arise. For example, in Search of Antisemitism, he wrote, quote, "If you ask, do I think Pat Buchanan is an anti-Semite? My answer is he is not one. But I think he said some anti-Semitic things." End quote. Oddly enough, as Sobran pointed out, quote, "My old boss, Bill Buckley, wrote an entire book called In Search of Antisemitism without bothering to define antisemitism." End quote. After reading what Buckley had written, Sobran said, quote, "At the time, I thought his inclusion of me was an oversight. I was wrong. The word antisemitism would lose its utility for Buckley if it were defined. As I observed in the book, an anti-Semite used to mean a man who hated Jews. Now it means a man who is hated by Jews." End quote. Ironically, the use of ill-defined labels like anti-Semitism to smear a man is actually straight out of the Soviet playbook. Sobran explains, quote, "The very word anti-Semite is reminiscent of the term anti-Soviet. It serves a similar function of facilitating imputations of ill-defined guilt. The strength of Western law has always been its insistence on definition. Clear definitions put a burden of proof on the accuser, and properly so. If you falsely accuse a man of murder or burglary, not only is he apt to be acquitted, you may pay a heavy penalty yourself. As a result, few of us are afraid of being charged with murders and burglaries we didn't commit." End quote. Likewise, Sobran pointed out that a term like anti-Semitism is useful for character assassination because the accuser never actually has to define or prove anything. He writes, quote, "If you want to distinguish between the innocent and the guilty, you define crimes precisely. If, however, you merely want to maximize the number of convictions, increase the power of the accuser, and create an atmosphere of dread, you define crimes as loosely as possible. We now have an incentive system that might have been designed to promote loose charges of anti-Semitism." End quote. Of course, Sobran did not hate the Jews and had exhibited exactly zero hostility toward them. He simply saw a problem with an Israel-first foreign policy strategy and happened to notice, like many others, that Jewish control over media and politics was substantial. He wasn't the first conservative to say this sort of thing and get in hot water for it either. Russell Kirk, for example, said on multiple occasions that neoconservatives mistook Tel Aviv for the capital of the United States. Outrage ensued. In any case, the accusation from Buckley against Sobran was enough to damn him in the press. Ironically, Sobran said that Buckley, his longtime mentor, once shared the same criticisms of Israel. He had simply changed with the prevailing political winds. Sobran wrote, quote, "In my 21 years at National Review, I had a front row seat. I watched closely as Bill Buckley changed from a jaunty critic of Israel to what I can only call a servile appeaser. In its early days, the magazine published robust editorials, blasting politicians who sacrificed American to Israeli interests in order to pander to the Jewish vote. In those days, it was considered risque to suggest that there was a Jewish vote. Today, Bill's magazine supports Israel with embarrassing sycophancy, never daring to intimate that Israeli and American interests may occasionally diverge. It has forgotten its own principles. Today, it would never dare to publish the editorials written by its great geopolitical thinker of those early days, James Burnham." End quote. Noticing Jewish influence in the media had become, according to Sobran, a career-ending taboo. He said, quote, "The fear of the label anti-Semitic is a fear of the power that is believed to lie behind it, Jewish power. Yet this is still pretty much unmentionable in journalism. It's rather as if sports writers covering pro basketball were prohibited from mentioning that the Los Angeles Lakers were in first place." End quote. Sobran hasn't been the only one to recognize that you aren't allowed to talk about Jewish influence. Take, for example, the more recent instance of Dave Chappelle, who said on Saturday Night Live, quote, "Early in my career, I learned that there are two words you should never say together. Those words are the and Jews. Never heard someone do good after they said that," end quote. He went on to say, quote, "If they're black, then it's a gang. If they're Italian, it's a mob. But if they're Jewish, it's a coincidence, and you should never speak about it," end quote. Not surprisingly, his monologue drew widespread blowback in the media, including the ire of the ADL. Buckley, for his part, had learned how to apply the anti-Semitic label effectively and with force against his opponents, as he often did in his later essays. For example, he once wrote, quote, "I find it impossible to defend Pat Buchanan against the charge that what he said and did during the period under examination amounted to anti-Semitism. Whatever it was that drove him to say and do it, most probably an iconoclastic temperament," end quote. What had Pat said, you may wonder? Among other things, Buchanan made televised remarks criticizing U.S. involvement in the Gulf War. He said, quote, "There are only two groups that are beating the drums for war in the Middle East, the Israeli Defense Ministry and its Amen Corner in the United States," end quote. Soon afterward, Buchanan referred to the U.S. Congress as Israeli-occupied territory. Later, Buchanan predicted that the men fighting in the Gulf War would be, quote, "kids with last names like McAllister, Murphy, Gonzalez, and Leroy Brown," end quote. Of this, Buckley said, quote, "There is no way to read that sentence without concluding that Pat Buchanan was suggesting that American Jews managed to avoid personal military exposure even while advancing military policies they uniquely engineer," end quote. Buckley's policing of the right-wing camp by way of vindictive smear campaigns that fed its members to the left liberal mob has been a long-standing strategy for many gatekeeping entities on the conservative right. It's one of the reasons the right is so rarely victorious in its opposition to the left, because elements on the right are constantly being destroyed by their own. Given Buckley's association with the Skull and Bones Society and the elites who controlled the White House, State Department, major banks, and the CIA, as well as connections to men like George H.W. Bush, one has to wonder if Buckley functioned as some sort of controlled opposition within the conservative ranks. Of this gatekeeping tendency on the right, Paul Gottfried once wrote, quote, "Conservatism, Inc. has a long history of purging undesirables who challenge its party lines. But those in charge of the movement typically hide this practice. When the movement can no longer conceal the obvious, it provides justifications for its actions, hoping that such will play well in the court of liberal public opinion. Thus, the movement has lied about its early expulsion of Jewish libertarians and then its later campaign against the John Birch Society, pretending in both cases that it was distancing itself from racists and anti-Semites. The real reason for these excommunications, as far as I can determine, was that those who were expelled did not share the aggressively anti-Soviet and anti-communist foreign policy that William F. Buckley Jr. and other editors at National Review were then promoting. After the neoconservative takeover of the movement in the 1980s, those isolated few who resisted lost their access to conservative funding and were removed from the mastheads of conservative publications. This blacklisting was in line with the movement's earlier history of expulsions, and such events became even more prevalent in the 1990s as paleoconservatives were pushing back hard against the neoconservative takeover of the authorized right." End quote. Buckley's motives for canceling Sobran, it turns out, were not purely ideological so much as pragmatic and political. In the end, Buckley was pressured by outside forces to get rid of Sobran. He sought both donors and respectability, and he saw the paleoconservatives as a threat to the attainment of those ends. As Jack Trotter wrote in Chronicles magazine in 2020, quote, "Sobran was fired in 1992 after charges were leveled at him by Midge Decter and her husband Norman Podhoretz, editor at Commentary. The crux of the matter was that Sobran's columns criticizing the Israeli lobby were deemed by Podhoretz and Decter, hypersensitive to perceived anti-Semitism as they were, to be scurrilous. In Decter's words, Sobran himself was little more than a crude and naked anti-Semite. Podhoretz and his wife, Midge Decter, maiden name Rosenthal, were both Jews. Podhoretz's parents immigrated from Poland, present-day Ukraine, and settled into the Jewish New York culture as staunch leftists. He gained acceptance to Harvard, but instead attended Columbia University and then later the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. He never intended to enter the rabbinate, but his father wanted to ensure that his son was nonetheless conversant in the intellectual tradition of his people as a non-observant New World Jew who treasured the Hebraic tradition, end quote. In other words, outside pressure from Jewish influence and other donors caused Buckley to detonate his relationship and decades-long friendship with Sobran. Again, he succumbed to the left liberal gaze and burned one of his friends to the ground to satiate detractors and donors. Today, we face similar problems on the right. Right-wing gatekeepers are often willing to broker for greater platform exposure through deals with centrists and leftists in exchange for eliminating extremist elements on the right. Often, as Gottfried pointed out, right-wing gatekeepers will do this without ever being asked. Those who do the policing of the ranks gain more power by destroying other right-wing opponents in the media, which is left-controlled space. One of the easiest ways to do this is to accuse those on the right of the kind of things the left liberal consensus finds most appalling: racism, antisemitism, and Nazism being the epithets of choice. To cancel, denounce, or dox someone isn't fundamentally about engaging with their arguments. It's about attaching some unforgivable sin to them in the form of a slur that triggers public outrage. Like Sobran, the goal is that the doxed become unemployable, untouchable, anathema, so that they're left driving FedEx delivery trucks. A respectable profession, to be sure, but not one generally associated with the kind of political and social power needed to lead the national conversation. This type of behavior is largely what prompted Charles Haywood to weigh in with his principle, "No enemies to the right," which was later amended to "No enemies on the right." Haywood noted that for the right to gain victory, it had to stop destroying its own by feeding them to wolves on the left. Yes, corrections to the camp should be made, but they should be made within the camp. The principle is simple: settle disputes privately, save your strength for destroying the real enemy on the left, where there are genuine and acceptable disagreements in strategy and cultural political engagement. Right-wing groups should agree to pursue their ends without trying to destroy or constantly countersignal one another. Haywood's original netter proposal came in an interaction about Rod Dreher, because Dreher had often spoken softly about the left, saving his fiercest attacks for those on the right. Of this tendency, Haywood wrote, quote, "Guys like Dreher endlessly complain about the left and its evils, but never do they wield actual power against the individuals about whose behavior they complain, which could advance their claimed goals. Instead, they only wield what power they have against individuals whose beliefs they regard as to their own right. These are the same individuals as those targeted by the left, and the more so they show any tendency to become leaders or network nodes on the right. Dreher is a prime example of this tendency on the supposed right. He always talks lovingly about his friends on the left, notably the odious David Brooks, and defends them to the last gasp. He does not seem to realize, or will not admit to himself, that his friends would gladly throw him to the wolves if he ever did anything such as, say, use a slur to refer to homosexuals or state the obvious, especially in light of his obsession with the scandals surrounding Catholic clergy, that many homosexuals are created by homosexual abuse of children, and that homosexuals abuse children at a vastly greater rate than normal people. Yet never, ever does he say anyone to his right is a friend. He runs from them in horror and hurts them when he can. In fact, the absolute limits of all acceptable rightward behavior for Dreher is set by reference to Dreher himself. Anything to his right is ipso facto unconscionable, disgusting, evil, or all three. End quote. By becoming a compliant gatekeeper for the left and drawing lines around conservative orthodoxy, Dreher had secured for himself an untouchable seat at the table, but at what cost? Again, Haywood writes, quote, "We can see the results of his compliance with the left dictates in the arc of Dreher's career. Dreher is never substantively attacked by the left because he is regarded as not a threat despite his notable prominence on the right. His defenders respond that his contribution is converting the normies. This is false. If he were converting the normies, he would be regarded as a threat and targeted. Rather, He is lecturing the already converted who are unhappy about left victories surging ever higher, advising them to be angry about the left, but never to take any determined action against the left. And always to police your mind and speech, to purify it of anything that the left might find too objectionable. If Dreher were honest and he looked at himself, he would realize that his actions show that for him, beginning with the end in mind means seeking the eternal domination of the left, end quote. As men like Dreher prove, the greatest obstacle to building a formidable movement on the right is actually vicious gatekeepers on the right, not the left. As these gatekeepers inevitably drift left, they publicly anathematize anyone to their immediate right, which drags the conservative movement further left and makes it impotent. The removal of actual conservatives on the right only solidifies a sure victory for the left. Unfortunately, many conservative Christians have also employed this strategy: pander left, punch right.